July. The morning Edna Whitmore knelt down in the back field and pressed the first lavender cutting into the clay soil of her tobacco farm. 3 of her neighbors laughed so hard, one of them had to grab the fence post to keep from falling over. That was the spring of 1983. It would be 9 years before anyone stopped laughing. Edna Whitmore had turned 41 that February, the same month the tobacco quota notice came in the mail. She had read it twice at the kitchen table, then folded it along its original creases and set it under the sugar bowl, which is where she put things she needed to think about before she could speak about them out loud. Her husband, Gerald, found it 3 days later when he was looking for a spoon. He read it once and threw it in the trash. Quotas down 40%, he said, like he was reporting the weather. We'll work with what we've got. Edna retrieved the letter from the trash that evening after Gerald had gone to watch the news. She smoothed it back flat and put it in the drawer with the farm ledgers. She had been doing the books since 1971, the year she and Gerald married and moved into the white farmhouse on Route 7 outside Harlan County, Kentucky. She knew every number on every page. She knew better than Gerald did what a 40% cut in quota meant for a farm that had been running thin since 1979. It meant they had maybe 3 years before the bank owned more of the land than they did. Gerald Whitmore was not a bad man. He was the kind of man who had learned farming from his father and his father's father, and believed with the same quiet certainty he applied to everything, that the way things had always been done was the way things ought to be done. Tobacco had kept this land since 1931. It would keep it now. He said this at the dinner table, at the feed store, at church on Sunday mornings. Edna heard him say it so many times she could have said it herself, word for word, with the same pauses, in the same places. She just did not believe it anymore. What Edna believed, sitting at the kitchen table with the ledgers open in front of her, was that they needed a second income stream. Something that did not depend on federal quota systems or the mood of the tobacco buyers who came through in August. Something that could grow while the tobacco was struggling and carry them when the tobacco finally gave out altogether. Because Edna had read enough newspapers by 1983 to understand that the tobacco program was not a permanent thing, whatever Gerald said at church. The idea came to her the way most of her ideas came, not in a flash, but slowly, the way a bruise comes up after a blow, first invisible and then suddenly, undeniably there. Her grandmother, Alma, had kept lavender along the fence line of her property in Breathitt County, long purple rows that her grandfather had always teased her about. Alma's folly, he called it, not unkindly. But every summer, a woman came from Lexington with a truck, and she paid Alma cash for the dried bundles, for the stems, for the oil Alma pressed in a second-hand press she kept in the smokehouse. Edna had stood in that smokehouse as a girl and breathed in the smell and thought it was the finest thing she had ever encountered in her life. Alma had called it Englischer Lavendel, a phrase her own grandmother had brought from somewhere in southern Germany where the family had originated before they settled in the mountains of eastern Kentucky 4 generations back. The English lavender, the old country lavender, the plant that did not need coddling. Alma always said, only patience. Edna was 50 pages into a university extension bulletin on essential oil crops before she told Gerald what she was thinking. He listened. He was a fair man, and he listened all the way through. Then he said, Edna, we're tobacco farmers. We've always been tobacco farmers. I know what we've been, she said. I'm thinking about what we're going to be. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he got up and poured himself more coffee, and the conversation was over. She ordered the plants anyway. 250. Lavender starts, lavandula, angustifolia, the English variety that Alma had grown, the one that could take a hard winter. She ordered them from a nursery in Tennessee and paid for them out of the household account without telling Gerald, which she had never done in 12 years of marriage. The starts arrived on a Thursday in April, packed in damp newspaper in a long, flat box. Edna carried the box to the back field herself, the one along the creek that had been fallow since Gerald's father hurt his back in 1978, and nobody had gotten around to replanting. She had spent 2 weeks that winter testing the soil pH, adjusting it with lime, tilling in gravel for drainage, because lavender hated wet feet and the creek field drained slow. She had done her homework. Nobody knew that yet, but she had. It took her 4 days to plant all 250 starts. She did it in the mornings before Gerald was up, and after supper, when the light was still good. Her daughter, 16-year-old Noreen, came out the second afternoon and sat on the fence and watched. "What is it?" Noreen asked. "Lavender. Like the soap smell?" "Like your great-great-grandmother's fence line," Edna said. "Hand me that trowel." Gerald saw the field on Saturday morning when he was walking the fence. He stood at the edge for a long time. Then he came inside and sat down at the kitchen table and said, "Edna, you put plants in the creek field." "I did. Lavender plants. 250 starts." He was quiet for a moment. "That field needs to be in tobacco rotation by next year if we're going to make quota." "We're 40% below quota already," Edna said. "That field being in tobacco isn't going to save us." He didn't argue. That was the thing about Gerald. He didn't argue. He just went quiet in a way that meant the conversation was over. And then he did not mention the lavender field again for 3 weeks. But other people did. Their neighbor Boyd Tackett was the first one to see it from the road. Boyd ran the biggest tobacco operation in the county and had opinions about everything delivered in a loud voice at the feed store on Saturday mornings. He saw the creek field on his way to pick up his mail, and he stopped his truck in the middle of Route 7 and stared for a full minute before driving on. By noon, it was the talk of the feed store. "Edna Whitmore's gone and planted flowers," Boyd said, in the tone a person uses to announce that something has gone badly wrong. Flowers. In tobacco country. Pete Slusher, who farmed the land on the other side of the creek, thought it was the funniest thing he'd heard all year. Lawrence Breck, who sold equipment and liked to weigh in on other people's farming decisions, said he'd always thought the Whitmore place was being run a little loose. The laughter that followed was the comfortable kind. The kind that comes when a group of people agree that someone else has made a mistake. Edna heard about it from the woman who ran the diner in town, who told her while pouring her coffee with an expression that was trying to be kind and not quite making it. "People are talking," the woman said. "People always are," Edna said, and took her coffee and did not say another word about it. The first summer, the lavender did not bloom. This was expected. First-year lavender establishes its root system and keeps its flowers to itself, putting all its energy underground where nobody can see it. Edna knew this from the extension bulletin. She knew it from 3 books she had ordered from the library in Lexington. She knew it from a letter she had written to a lavender grower in Oregon, who had written back 6 pages in a cramped hand, full of practical information about first-year mortality rates and soil temperature, and the importance of not overwatering. She knew that the plants were doing exactly what they were supposed to do. Nobody else knew that, and nobody else asked. What they saw was a field of small gray-green bushes that looked, by August, slightly sad. Boyd Tackett drove past and told Pete Slusher that the Whitmore woman had spent money she didn't have on plants that looked half dead. Pete agreed that it was a shame, the way some women got ideas. Gerald said nothing at home. He was working longer hours in the tobacco fields, covering what the quota reduction had taken away. By sheer effort, the way he covered most problems. He was not cruel about the lavender. He just treated it as though it did not exist, which was, in its own way, harder to bear than if he had argued. Noreen, by then 17, started coming out to the creek field in the evenings to help with the weeding. She didn't say much. She just showed up with gloves on and pulled weeds alongside her mother, and Edna did not say anything about how much that meant to her. The second summer, the lavender bloomed. Not all of it. Maybe 60% of the plants put up flower spikes in that second July, thin and tentative, pale purple at the tips. But 60% of 250 plants was still 150 plants blooming along the creek field. And when the wind came up from the south in the late afternoon and moved across that field, you could smell it from the road. Gerald walked down to the creek field one evening in late July. Edna watched him from the kitchen window. He stood in the field for a long time, hands in his pockets, looking at the rows. He didn't say anything about it when he came in. But that night at supper he asked, for the first time, what the plan was. Edna had the plan ready. She had been ready for 2 years. She laid it out for him the way she laid out the ledgers, methodically, with numbers. The dried bundle market in Lexington, the 2 craft fairs she had already contacted, one in Berea and one in Danville, the essential oil market, which required a small still she could buy secondhand from a retiring grower in Virginia for $300. The culinary lavender market, which was small but growing, and the thing she had been most careful about, the piece of the plan that required the most explanation. In 5 years, when the field was fully mature and she had expanded to a second field, the lavender operation could generate enough income to replace what the tobacco quota reduction had cost them. Not in year 2, in year 5, maybe year 6. Gerald listened to all of it. Then he said, 5 years is a long time. It is, Edna said. What do we do in the meantime? We work the tobacco, and we grow the lavender, and we don't spend money we don't have on things we don't need. He was quiet for a moment. You already ordered that still from Virginia, didn't you? Edna looked at her plate. I put down a deposit. Gerald made a sound that was not quite a laugh, and not quite anything else. He picked up his fork. He didn't say yes, and he didn't say no. And Edna had been married to him long enough to know that for Gerald Whitmore, that was as close to agreement as she was going to get. The third summer, Edna drove to Berea with 40 dozen dried lavender bundles and 8 ounces of oil she had pressed herself in the smokehouse, and came home $260 richer. It was not a large amount. It was proof. She also drove to Lexington that fall and sat in a room with 6 other small farmers who were all trying to figure out what to plant, now that the federal tobacco program was clearly on its way out. A man from the University Extension Office talked for 2 hours about diversification. Edna listened and took notes and asked 2 questions that made the extension agent stop and look at her with more attention than he'd been giving the room. On the drive home, she stopped at a diner outside Richmond and ate a piece of pie and thought about her grandmother, Alma, pressing lavender oil in Breathitt County, while her grandfather called it Alma's Folly, and the woman from Lexington came every summer with her truck and her cash. Some knowledge skips a generation, Edna thought. Some of it waits. The 4th summer brought a drought. July came in dry and stayed dry through most of August, and the tobacco was thin, and the corn in the county was worse. But lavender, and Edna had read this, had specifically sought it out in her research. Lavender was built for dry summers. It came from the Mediterranean. from the stony hillsides of Provence, where it baked in the sun and the soil barely held moisture, and what would have killed most crops only made the oil content richer and the fragrance stronger. The creek field in that drought summer of 1986 was the finest thing Edna had ever grown. The bundles she dried that fall sold out in one afternoon at the Danville Fair. She had started a mailing list, paper, handwritten, because this was 1986, of customers who had bought from her the year before, and 3 of them drove to the farm directly to buy before she could even pack the truck. A woman from Louisville asked her if she could supply a small soap-making business. Edna said she'd have to see the numbers first, and the woman looked at her with an expression that said she had not expected that answer. And Edna thought, yes, that's right. That's exactly right. She ordered another 150 plants that fall and began the PH work on the south field. Gerald saw her tilling the south field on a Saturday morning and came out to the fence. He watched her for a while. Then he said, "You're expanding." "Southfield's been sitting since your father's time," Edna said. "Soil's good if you amend it." He was quiet. Then, "How much did you bring in at Danville?" she told him. He was quiet for longer this time. "That's more than I thought." "I know," she said. He didn't offer to help. But the following weekend, without saying anything about it, he fixed the irrigation line that ran along the Southfield fence, the one that had been leaking since spring. Edna saw him out there with his tools on a Sunday afternoon and understood that this was Gerald's way of saying something he did not have the words for. In Harlan County, the laughter had not stopped exactly, but it had changed in character. Boyd Tackett still made remarks at the feed store, but they had taken on a slightly different tone. Less certain, more reflexive. The way people keep telling a joke after it has stopped being funny because they have told it so many times that stopping would require admitting something. Pete Slusher had stopped making the joke altogether, which Edna noticed. What Boyd Tackett and Pete Slusher and Lawrence Breck did not know, because Edna had not told anyone, and Gerald was not a man who talked about his wife's business at the feed store, was that the Louisville Soap Company had placed a standing order, 60 pounds of dried lavender per quarter, paid in advance. Edna had the check in the drawer with the ledgers. She looked at it, sometimes in the evenings, not because she needed to look at it, but because she had waited a long time for a piece of paper that said, "You were right." The 5th summer, Noreen came home from her first year at community college in Lexington and walked straight out to the lavender fields before she even put her bags down. She stood in the south field, which was fully planted now and coming into its second bloom, and turned around slowly with her hands out, palms down, the way you check the height of something. Then she came inside and sat down at the kitchen table and said, "Mom, this is real." "It's always been real," Edna said. "No, I mean..." Noreen stopped. She was 20 years old, and she had been away for a year, and she had the particular expression of someone who has been somewhere new and come back and seen their home differently. "I mean, people in Lexington are paying serious money for lavender products. The natural food stores, the craft stores. There's a whole market for this." "I know," Edna said. Noreen looked at her mother for a moment. "How long have you known?" "Since 1983, Edna said. Noreen was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You should have told more people." "I tried," Edna said. "Nobody wanted to hear it." She did not say this bitterly. It was simply the fact of the matter, and facts were things Edna Whitmore stated plainly and then moved past. The 6th summer was 1989. The tobacco program had been cut again. 3 farms in the county had sold parcels of land to cover debt. Boyd Tackett, who had doubled down on tobacco in the years when Edna was building her lavender operation, was now in difficult conversations with his bank that everyone in the county knew about, and no one discussed directly. The Whitmore farm was the only operation in Harlan County turning a profit on something other than cattle. Edna did not point this out. She was not built for pointing things out. She kept her books, ran her fields, filled her orders, and drove to Lexington 4 times a year to meet with buyers who now knew her by name and called ahead to reserve her allotment before the season started. It was at one of those Lexington meetings, in the fall of 1989, that she met a woman named Frances, who ran a lavender cooperative in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. Frances was 10 years older than Edna and had been growing lavender since 1974, which was longer than anyone Edna had met in person. They had lunch, and then they had dinner, and by the time Edna drove home, she had agreed to join the cooperative's collective marketing arrangement, which meant her products could now reach buyers in Washington, D.C., and Baltimore who were looking for exactly what Edna grew and could not find it close enough to home. The cooperative arrangement changed everything about the scale of what was possible. Edna sat in the driveway for 10 minutes after she got home before she went inside. She was doing math in her head, the way she always did her best thinking, quietly, with numbers, turning them over until they showed her what they were. Gerald was up, even though it was past 10. He was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of decaf, which meant he had been waiting. "How was Lexington?" he said. She sat down and told him about Frances and the cooperative and the numbers she had been doing in the car. She told him what an expanded arrangement would mean for their income in year 2 and year 3. She told him she would need to hire someone part-time during harvest season, starting next year. Gerald listened to all of it. Then he said, "Edna, I owe you an apology." She looked at him. "I never helped with those fields," he said. "Not really. You built that whole thing without me." He stopped. He was not comfortable with this kind of speech, and she knew it was costing him something to make it. "I fixed a leaky pipe one time. That's not the same as believing in what you were doing." Edna was quiet for a moment. "You didn't stand in my way," she said finally. "That's a low bar," Gerald said. "It's a higher bar than most," she said. He looked at her across the kitchen table. "I should have been out in that field in 1983 when Boyd Tackett was laughing at you from the road. I should have said something then." "What would you have said?" He thought about it. "That my wife does her homework," he said. "That she had read more about lavender than any man in this county would ever bother to read about anything. That if Edna Whitmore put plants in a field, there was a reason for it." He looked at his hands. "I knew all of that. I just didn't say it." Edna reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. She did not say that it was all right. It was not entirely all right, and they were both too old for comfortable untruths. What she said instead was, "Help me plan the expansion. I need someone who can read a topography map." Gerald looked up. "The ridge field," she said. "The drainage would need to be worked out before we could plant." He was quiet for a moment. Then something in his face shifted slightly, in a way she had not seen in years. "I can do that," he said. "I know you can," she said. By 1992, the lavender fields at the Whitmore farm ran from the creek all the way to the ridge, a long sweep of purple that was visible from Route 7 from late June through August, and had become, without anyone planning it or naming it as such, something people drove out to see. A woman from the Harlan County Tourism Office called that summer and asked if Edna would be willing to be featured in a county brochure. Edna said she'd think about it. Boyd Tackett passed the farm one morning that July and pulled his truck over on the shoulder the way he had done 9 years earlier. He sat there for a long time. Edna, who was working the near row, saw him and kept working. After a while, he got out of the truck and walked over to the fence. He stood with his hands on the top rail and looked at the fields for a long time without saying anything. Edna came to the end of her row and straightened up and looked at him. "I said some things at the feed store," Boyd said. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the lavender. "I know," Edna said. "I was wrong. I know that too," she said. She pulled off one of her gloves. "You want to see the pressing room? I built it out of the smokehouse." Boyd Tackett looked at her. He was a man who had expected anger and received something else entirely, and he was not quite sure what to do with it. "Yeah," he said after a moment. "Yeah, I'd like to see that." She led him across the yard and into the smokehouse, which smelled the way it had smelled since her grandmother's stories. Clean and sharp and unmistakably itself. The press was running a slow batch of summer oil. Boyd stood in the doorway and breathed it in and did not say a word for a full minute. "Your grandmother grew lavender," he said finally. It was not a question. He had known Alma Whitmore, or known of her, the way everyone in these counties knew of everyone else going back enough generations. She called it Englischer Lavendel, Edna said. The old family name for it. She always had it along her fence. She did. Boyd was quiet. "I didn't know that was where you got the idea. Most people don't ask where ideas come from," Edna said. "They just watch to see if they work." She filled a small bottle from the current pressing and handed it to him. He held it like he wasn't sure what to do with it. "Take it home to your wife," Edna said. "She used to buy my bundles at the Danville Fair. Tell her I'll have the new season stock ready in August." Boyd looked at the bottle for a moment. Then he put it in his shirt pocket and nodded. Once, and that was as close as Boyd Tackett was ever going to get to saying, he was sorry. It was enough. Some apologies come in the shape of a man standing in a doorway, breathing in the smell of something he once made a joke about, and understanding now what it cost the person to keep going anyway. Edna understood that. She had spent 9 years understanding things that nobody else in Harlan County wanted to look at directly. She had done it without bitterness and without stopping and without needing anyone's permission, which is the only way a thing like that can actually be done. The Ridgefield came into full bloom the following summer. Gerald was out there in the mornings before the heat came up, checking the drainage lines he had designed himself on a piece of graph paper at the kitchen table the winter before. Noreen drove down from Lexington on weekends during harvest season and worked the rows alongside her parents. And on those evenings, the three of them ate supper on the back porch and could smell the lavender from there, if the wind was right. Some evenings it was very right, and on those evenings Gerald Whitmore would sometimes look out over the fields his wife had built from 250 small gray-green plants, and a piece of knowledge her grandmother had carried out of eastern Kentucky and her great-great-grandmother had carried across an ocean. And he would say nothing at all, because there was nothing that needed to be said. Edna knew what his silence meant now. It meant, "I see it." It meant, "I should have seen it sooner." It meant, "The person sitting next to me ran the numbers in 1983, and she was right, and she kept going anyway, and because she did, this farm is still ours." That was everything.